Æthelwulf, the Old English for noble wolf, was the only son of Egbert, King of Wessex. The precise date of his birth is unknown, though if Æthelwulf was in his early 50s when he married later in his life in 856, then an approximate year of 804 indicates his birth early in the reign of his father. The long and important reign of Æthelwulf's father Ecgberht has been extensively covered in a previous episode. However, it's important here to cover the key events as a backdrop to the succession of his son. Ecgberht, and thus Æthelwulf's heritage, was actually Kentish, with Ecgbert's father even ruling Kent for a time as king. Ealhmund was also a descendant of Cerdic, the founder of Wessex, which gave both Ecgberht and his son a claim to the throne of Wessex. With this tenuous claim, Ecgberht attempted to claim the throne in 786, following the death of the assassinated King Cynewulf. Succession in this period was a bloody business. The kings of Wessex, as well as the other smaller southern kingdoms of Sussex, Essex and Kent, bent the knee to the Mercians. Yet this was soon to change with two key deaths. Firstly, in 796, Offa, the great king of Mercia, died, which would ultimately see a line of weaker kings attempt, and fail, to maintain the Mercian supremacy south of the Humber. Secondly, and more importantly for Æthelwulf, the man who had pipped his father Egbert to the throne in 786, died in 802. Egbert had spent his period of exile in Francia, heavily immersing himself in the culture of Charlemagne's court, and in 802 headed home to stake his claim to Wessex, which was successful. Unfortunately, next to nothing is known about the first decades of King Egbert's rule, and thus Æthelwulf's early life. Egbert likely consolidated his hold on Wessex, driving out the supporters of Beorhtric, who had effectively ruled as a Mercian puppet of sorts, having been married to Offa's daughter. Æthelwulf was likely too young to have taken part in his father's early campaign against the Dumnoni, who occupied the southwestern region of Britain, roughly corresponding today to modern Cornwall. Egbert would suppress this people several times, firstly in 815, and then a decade later, and finally in the 830s, when he defeated them and their alliance with Viking invaders. Æthelwulf truly arises into the light of history during 825, when the prince would have been around 21. In Mercia, Offa's successor, Ceanwulf, was ultimately succeeded by Beornwulf, a king eager to reassert the Mercian supremacy over Egbert's Wessex. This dream was smashed in 825 at the decisive Battle of London, which saw Beornwulf's army driven back into Mercia. An immediate result of the battle was that King Egbert ordered his son Æthelwulf, along with a large part of his victorious host, to invade and occupy the lands of Surrey, Sussex, Kent and Essex. Æthelwulf was successful in driving out the Mercian puppet king of Kent, Baldred, with his father establishing him as effective sub-king of a newly created larger kingdom of Kent. This arrangement saw Æthelwulf take direct control of these southeastern regions, with Egbert even ruling by request rather than directly, thus giving his son real power and preparation for the rule of the greater kingdom of Wessex. 825 was not only a key year in both the life and reign of Æthelwulf and his father, but had larger implications for the future creation of England. The Mercian supremacy had been permanently damaged. Egbert even managed to drive the new king Wiglaf from his kingdom in a push north in 829, even acquiring London and the title of Bretwalda. Æthelwulf would prove an effective lieutenant to his father, who reorganised the kingdoms of Sussex, Surrey, Essex and Kent into a larger Kingdom of Kent, ruled by the West Saxon prince. Since father and son had strong ties to Kent, it made sense for them to have a permanent presence there in Æthelwulf. Æthelwulf ruled this new territory as a sub-king under Egbert, but had a reasonable degree of independence, with rural political power as indicated by charters in which Egbert requested rather than commanded his son. Æthelwulf ruled his sub-kingdom in cooperation with the aldermen of the region, which also made him effective and popular. It is likely that Æthelwulf married his first wife Osburh around the early 820s. Though he would marry again after her death, Osburh mothered all of his children. Asser, the biographer of Alfred, Æthelwulf's most famous son, states that Osburh was the daughter of a certain Oslac, described as the king's famous butler and a man descended from Jutish royalty, the Jutes having previously ruled the Isle of Wight. With Osburh, Æthelwulf sired 6 known children: Æthelstan, who was old enough in 839 to be appointed King of Kent, Æthelbald, Ecgberht, Ethelswith, a daughter, and 2 much younger sons, Æthelred and Alfred. Interestingly, 2 possibilities present themselves to us, given the large age gaps between Æthelwulf's children. If we assume Æthelstan was in his late teens or early 20s, more likely in 839, given he was deemed mature enough to be appointed sub-king of Kent, this places his date of birth around the early 820s, or even before. Given we have an approximate date of Alfred's birth at around 849, this leaves an almost 30-year gap. Even if Osburh had birthed Æthelstan around aged 15, for example, she would have been in her middle 40s when delivering Alfred. Either Osburh was particularly fertile then, or, more likely, she was in fact Æthelwulf's second of 3 eventual wives, and not the mother of his eldest sons. Ethelred, Alfred, and Ethelswith were, however, Osburhs given their closeness in age. In 829, Egbert managed to drive Wiglaf from Mercia, but his gains would not last, with the King of Wessex losing control of the London Mint just a year later, as well as control over Essex and the county of Berkshire. Such losses would have dented Æthelwulf's power somewhat, but not loosened his grip on the core region of Kent. Unlike Mercian control over Kent, which had alienated the native elites through its distant rule, it appears Æthelwulf's residency in the kingdom and maintenance of it as a separate political entity forged a lasting acceptance of the House of Egbert's authority there. Despite his position, and all his father had accomplished, however, Æthelwulf's succession to the kingship of Wessex itself was by no means a foregone conclusion. Indeed, no son had peacefully succeeded his father for nearly 2 centuries. Egbert himself had attempted to seize the throne in 786, the king's Cynewulf having been assassinated. Egbert, though, was determined to ease Æthelwulf's path to the crown, and to this end set up a council at Kingston upon Thames in 838. Over the years, the old king had amassed great wealth through his conquests, and he now used this to great effect by granting lands through charter to the sees of Canterbury and Winchester, an act, he assured them, that would be confirmed when Æthelwulf succeeded. This worked well, with Æthelwulf succeeding Egbert on his death. One of his first acts as king, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, was making Æthelstan King of Kent in his own place, which nominally gave Æthelstan control over Kent, Sussex, Essex and Surrey. This move, however, was largely superficial, the young prince not exercising the same power his father had under the great Egbert. Æthelstan did not issue charters in his own right, and was not necessarily consulted. Æthelwulf was also a stark presence in the region, making regular visits there, and perhaps undermining his son's authority. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the family's time in exile on the continent, and his own father's setup, Æthelwulf maintained a Carolingian-style high kingship, with his son as sub-king and being careful to maintain Wessex and the enlarged kingdom of Kent as separate kingdoms, unified through him. He promoted the interests of the major aldermen, even having them witness charters ahead of his sons on occasion, which was likely appreciated and bound these important men closer to him. In terms of his wider influence, Æthelwulf effectively strengthened the position of Wessex as the preeminent kingdom of Britain via soft power. Unlike his father Egbert, Æthelwulf didn't have grand ambitions of conquest, though he was interested in creating a greater union, and thus dependence, between his kingdom and Mercia. Mercia had experienced a sharp decline following Egbert's initial victory at London, and then his push to Dore in 829. While Egbert did not hold Mercia, and may even have voluntarily withdrew to allow Wiglaf to resume his kingship there was no question of who dominated southern England. By around 840, Mercia's king, Bertwulf, now faced an even more formidable foe: poverty. Though not as sexy as a rampaging West Saxon army, lack of funds was in some ways worse for his power. The few surviving documents from the era attest that he was running out of money. This was important, given that the king did not simply rule through bloody dictate, but was in fact the hub of an intricate web of obligation and dependence, in which it was fully expected he would give land, money, precious objects that bound senior lords to him. These gifts, in turn, allowed these senior lords to do the same down the hierarchy. From Bertwulf's accession, it is evident that the coinage of both Mercia and Wessex were very similar, even being struck by the same moneyers, which itself implies a desire to standardise trade between Mercia and its more powerful neighbour, something that Æthelwulf would have been more than happy to do. London may have been an important factor in this. In the 830s, the traditionally Mercian town had fallen into Ecgbert's orbit, along with its mint. However, soon after Æthelwulf's accession, it was returned to the waning Mercians. Add to this political mix the fact that Bertwulf had seized the crown to begin with under very suspicious circumstances, in which he almost certainly murdered Wigstan, the son and successor of Wiglaf, who had fought Egbert's push into Mercia in 829. Having usurped the throne from the W dynasts, Bertwulf may have been a pliable ally, if not quite a puppet of Æthelwulf. This appears so given that Æthelwulf took as much as he gave. Though London and its key mint were returned as an act of goodwill, Berkshire, which had been under Mercian control, was at some stage in the 840s returned to the West Saxon fold, though in yet another sign of increasing unification, or at least close cooperation, the local ealdorman, another Æthelwulf, was allowed to retain his position despite being a man of Derby and thus Mercian. Though Æthelwulf's domestic influence was growing, however, the Vikings continued to be a nuisance. The king, of course, would have been no stranger to these raiders, with the younger Æthelwulf possibly even aiding his father Egbert at the Battle of Hingston Down in 838. Since the mid-840s, Viking raids had kept the ealdormen of Somerset, Dorset, Kent and Wessex busy, with 850 marking a dark milestone. The Vikings wintered on the Isle of Thanet, close to the Kentish coast. The first time the raiders had remained over winter. Thanet too was not just some windswept rock, but in fact home to an important royal nunnery, with extensive trading links to Francia. That such an important place was under the control of a group of defenceless nuns must have seemed ridiculous to the invaders who gleefully occupied the area. The Vikings, however, did not by any means have things their own way. Like his father in 836, Æthelwulf suffered a defeat at Carhampton in 843, when he faced a Danish force that had disembarked from around 35 ships. Yet elsewhere, his son, the King of Kent, Æthelstan, along with the ealdorman Alcea of Kent, won a notable victory at sea in 850, off of the coast of Sandwich in Kent. During this struggle, the duo beat back the Viking fleet, capturing 9 ships and driving the rest away. Unfortunately, it's likely that Æthelstan died soon after this, maybe even as a result of the battle, given his name fades from records around this time. The Viking onslaught too would not let up. 851 was the key year for Æthelwulf in his personal battle with the heathens. Following Sandwich, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records 5 more attacks on southern England throughout 851. A large Danish fleet of around 350 ships even took both London and Canterbury, which prompted Bertwulf of Mercia to march to their relief. However, he was defeated and the Vikings moved into Surrey, where they were confronted by King Æthelwulf and his other son, Æthelbald. Details on the subsequent Battle of Alcea are sadly scant, though it was certainly famous enough at the time for Lupus, Abbot of Ferrières, to mention it in his letter to the king later on and in flattering terms. The most likely location is the area where the modern village of Ockley is today. The Chronicle describes the encounter as the greatest slaughter of heathens up to that point, certainly undoing the previous reverse at Carhampton, cementing Æthelwulf's own reputation for martial prowess. Around a year after Alcea, King Bertwulf died and was succeeded by Burgred, who, with Æthelwulf, maintained the close alliance, with Burgred even marrying Ethelswith in 853, and the West Saxon king marching with his new son-in-law in the same year to overawe the Welsh princes and re-establishing the old Mercian hegemony over them. Up to this point, we've avoided 2 major events of Æthelwulf's reign, which would become interconnected: the birth of his greatest son and his desire to go on pilgrimage to Rome. To facilitate the latter ambition would require preparation, laying the groundwork both practically and politically. As he recovered from the previous years of Viking incursions in 852, the king must have been bluntly aware that leaving his kingdom at this point was insane. Practically speaking, the trip was not impossible, with safe houses dotting the traditional route to Rome. Æthelwulf and his father had strong connections with Francia, Egbert having lived at Charlemagne's court from 786 to his accession in 802. Æthelwulf's youngest son Alfred was born in Wantage, within the newly acquired Berkshire, in around 849. Since Alfred was the youngest of 4 sons, with 2 of his likely half-brothers grown to manhood by the early 850s, it was unlikely that he was viewed as a serious contender to succeed to either his father or even his successor after him. With Æthelstan's death, the second son Æthelbald became the elder Ætheling, witnessing charters from 841 onward. Since charter witnessing was begun around 10 to 12 years of age, although some estimates are even 6 or 7, it is likely that Alfred's elder brother was a young man in his early 20s by the early 850s. The next brother, Ethelbert, was also old enough to be politically active by temporarily taking power in 855. Alfred then was a long prospect, as was his elder brother by Osburh, Ethelred. Given this, it's no surprise that Alfred, and maybe Ethelred too, were deemed expendable enough to make the trip in their father's stead. The pilgrimage would serve 3 main purposes: firstly to gain news from Rome and en route through Francia, which was always precious; secondly for plain pious reasons; and thirdly, but no less importantly, the image of a royal son, a representative of the House of Ecgberht, in the centre of Christianity in Europe, had huge propaganda capital and reinforced the legitimacy of Æthelwulf's line, which was at that point still only 2 generations old. In 853, the young Alfred, all of 4 years old at the time, made the hazardous journey to Rome and entered the presence of Pope Leo IV. We can safely dispense with Asser's later assertion, possibly at the behest of King Alfred himself, that the toddler was anointed as King of Wessex, given the political reality aforementioned. This is not really in any doubt. The Pope later wrote to Æthelwulf himself explaining the ceremony, quote, "We have now graciously received your son Alfred, whom you were anxious to send at this time to the threshold of the holy apostles, and we have decorated him as a spiritual son, with the dignity of the belt and vestments of the consulate, as is customary with Roman consuls, because he gave himself into our hands." That Alfred and his biographer Asser later attached such significance to the event is no surprise. However, for Æthelwulf, the purpose was not to anoint a younger son, but to forge a very real link between his house and the papacy. With the Pope himself as Alfred's spiritual father, Æthelwulf had created both legitimacy for his own regime and a strong link with God's chief representative on earth. Alfred was back in England by 854, with his father accelerating his own plans for a personal pilgrimage to the Eternal City. Yet for Alfred and Ethelred, the younger of several sons, to make the pilgrimage was one thing, but for the king himself to leave his kingdom while Viking incursions racked its shores was quite another. While in hindsight we know that the House of Ecgberht would endure, in one form or another, till the present day, to Æthelwulf his dynasty was only in its 2nd generation, with other families perhaps more than willing to wait for the opportune moment to stake their own claim to the kingship, much as Æthelwulf's father had done in 802, following Beorhtric's death. Using the example of his father, who used bribery to secure his crown in 839, Æthelwulf decided to mimic this in securing the Witan's support, or at least the clergy component of it, for both his continued reign and that of one of his surviving sons, should he die before his return. In a staggering and controversial move, the king issued a decimation, or a tenth, in which he gave up a tenth of his lands to the church, and also to some nobility. While the decimation may have had other economic motives behind it, in trying to help the West Saxon economy, it's quite obvious that the king was first and foremost trying to buy his subjects' loyalty in his absence. Politically, at least in theory, Æthelwulf may have thought himself safe, leaving his kingdom divided and in the hands of his 2 eldest surviving sons. Prior to his departure in 855, he left Wessex under the rule of Æthelbald and the sub-kingdom of Kent under Æthelbert. Now even if he did perish, and the Witan was split on the succession, both his sons were in power and in place to press their claim, the elder already effectively ruling Wessex, and his presumed heir ruling as under-king. With matters settled, thus undertook his controversial pilgrimage, an unprecedented event for an Anglo-Saxon king. Notably, the 6-year-old Alfred was said to have accompanied his father on what was his second trip. En route, the royal party headed to the court of Charles the Bold, with preparations for an intriguing announcement being put into place while he was there. Charles personally escorted the West Saxon king to the edge of his territory, where he entered the domain of Emperor Lothar, Charles's brother. From there, Æthelwulf was guided to northern Italy by Markward, the former abbot of Broome, and a former monk at Lupus's monastery at Ferrières. Upon finally arriving in Rome, the party passed through the gates of the Leonine city to take up residence in the Anglo-Saxon quarter. If the whole business was not extraordinary enough, the king was certainly not anxious to hurry home, remaining in Rome for around a year. This length of time was likely for mixed reasons, mostly due to the fact that there was a papal succession crisis ongoing, and the king obviously wanted to ingratiate himself with the eventual victor, but also probably because he was just devout and wanted to visit as many shrines in the city as possible. Æthelwulf was not shy in his gift-giving, with a new Pope Benedict III receiving a magnificent golden crown, weighing 4 pounds, as well as a golden goblet and a gilded candlestick. In addition, he gave a number of costly religious robes, including one of imperial purple and embossed with golden keys. Æthelwulf was not stingy either when it came to spreading his wealth beyond the papal court itself, donating gold and silver coins to the Roman people too. All this generosity too had a purpose: to emphasise the West Saxon king was easily the rival of the Carolingians, at least in wealth and gift-giving, if not power. With Pope Benedict III safely in place, and suitably impressed, Æthelwulf finally set off back home in 856, though before reaching the shores of Wessex, he had one final, and perhaps the most controversial task to accomplish, left on his to-do list. Moving once more through the Alps, he and his party reunited with the court of Charles the Bold, and now the other great purpose of his pilgrimage was revealed. Around a year before, it's likely that Osburh, Alfred's mother, was already dead, as now Æthelwulf would marry the daughter of the Frankish king, Judith. This in and of itself wasn't necessarily a bad thing. For a Frankish princess to marry at all was unusual. Most daughters were usually destined for the church, and would have provided Æthelwulf with an added degree of legitimacy, marrying into the Carolingian dynasty. The problem was that Charles too was well aware of this political gravitas, and furthermore knew he held the upper hand in bargaining. The ageing Æthelwulf could marry Judith, all of 12 years old, and perhaps also receive trading benefits and perhaps even a solid alliance against the Vikings. But Judith would not merely be the king's wife, but an anointed monarch. For the West Saxon elite back home, this would have been about as triggering as can be. The last queen, Egbert, the daughter of the great Mercian King Offa, had effectively ruled Wessex as the consort of Beorhtric, predecessor of Ecgberht, who had been driven out of the kingdom in 786. Beorhtric, having seized Wessex, had craved the support of the powerful Offa and jumped at the chance of a marriage alliance. However, according to Alcea, King Alfred's biographer, she used the leverage of her father to undermine her husband, even poisoning rivals at court. Indeed, Egbert's reputation suffered greatly given she was supposedly responsible for the death of her royal husband himself. In 802, she had attempted to use poison to murder a young favourite of the king, but instead killed the both of them, subsequently fleeing to Francia, where it was said she even rejected the marriage suit of Charlemagne himself. It is primarily due to Egbert, according to Alcea, that subsequent generations found the idea of a queen repugnant, preferring the term king's wife instead. That Æthelwulf would have been unaware of this aversion and the political ramifications of this provision to his marriage is absurd. The king, however, must have felt that the political kudos and perks of a Carolingian marriage alliance far outweighed any possible backlash among the West Saxon elite. If he did think this, then he would be proven dead wrong. With Æthelwulf's acceptance of this condition, the marriage ceremony took place at Burgred on Thursday 1st of October 856, presided over by the Archbishop of Reims. Some of the West Saxon party must have shifted uneasily with concern as the service did not end with the joining the two royal houses, but continued on with a formal ordo of coronation for Judith. The Archbishop then announced loudly that God had chosen Judith not just to be Æthelwulf's consort, but to rule with him. Then, with the unambiguous words, "May the Lord crown you," he anointed her head with the holy chrism, and then the crown. Her status was now ordained by God and irreversible. It would have been strange if an atmosphere of trepidation had not overcome the West Saxon party as they reached the Channel coast in mid-October of 856. It was highly likely that the news of the marriage, and more importantly Judith's enthronement, reached Wessex soon after the event, given the trading links that were active at the time. The waters of the Channel proved calmer, perhaps, than the reaction across it. According to Alcea, Æthelwulf's regent and eldest son, Æthelbald, greeted his father with revolt, refusing to hand power back. This was also no childish rebellion by a single atheling, but a move backed by powerful men. Bishop Ælfstan of Sherborne and the alderman of Somerset, Æthelwulf, backed Æthelbald, a reality made more bitter given these men were formerly trusted advisors of the king. The underlying causes of the rebellion were obvious, even if the catalyst had been Judith's coronation. Æthelbald may have naturally resented the reduction of his eventual landholdings that the decimation had accomplished. It is also known that Æthelwulf, unlike Ecgberht, had been a much more hands-on overlord, given his first son Æthelstan held little real power. For a young and ambitious Æthelbald, who had tasted real power over the previous year or so, such a prospect of a return to a politically neutered state must have been anathema. Æthelwulf's marriage to his young Carolingian bride had other implications too that would have been bitter food for thought for all of the king's sons. Such a prestigious marriage may have given a natural preference to any sons sired over them, something Æthelbald was not willing to countenance. Indeed, what Æthelwulf was thinking when he lighted on the idea of a marriage to Judith can only really be guessed at. To some, it may be remarkable if the king really thought that such a move would not cause such a reaction. Another final reason may have been purely practical. Anglo-Saxon kings were primarily tasked as warriors and defenders of their people. In his early 50s, Æthelwulf had already been on the throne for 17 years and was old by the standards of the time, at least stood next to his younger and more vigorous sons. Furthermore, Æthelbald was clearly capable of both ruling and fighting the increasingly ferocious Vikings, having proved himself at Ecgberht beside his father, and having effectively ruled Wessex anyway the past year. To many, including the bishop and alderman, it may simply have seemed to them time for the old king to step aside. Remarkably, given recent events and the civil turmoil so characteristic of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Æthelwulf partly acceded to their wishes. He would partially step aside, placing the stability of Wessex before his own pride. Æthelwulf maintained a rule of sorts, compromising that Æthelbald should retain control of Wessex proper, but that he take the eastern provinces, which his other son, Ethelbert, dutifully gave up. So it was that Æthelwulf ended his reign as partial King of Wessex, though, according to Alcea, he was deferred to in formally setting in place the succession. This is odd, given that he had given up any real power in Wessex itself, though this may have been Alcea, and thus King Alfred's doing, a way to patch up his father's damaged image as a betrayed and perhaps foolish man. Æthelwulf's will is actually lost to us, but Alfred's later will does refer to it. Æthelwulf clearly envisaged a split between his eldest sons, with Wessex remaining under the control of Æthelbald and the Kingdom of Kent going to the loyal Ethelbert. Such a division may have been a practical means to avoid civil war after his death, or maybe a very good way to deprive the treacherous elder son of claiming all the kingdom as punishment for his betrayal. Of course, we'll never truly know. Whatever the reasons, this decision was clearly potentially disastrous from a unification standpoint, though such ideas of a unified England at this point may have been vague to say the least. Had such a division stood, then it would have likely provided easy pickings for the great heathen army that came later, with Alfred or one of his brothers ruling a diminished Wessex. It almost seems sometimes that Æthelwulf was trying to prevent Alfred's future succession to our eyes from the distant future. He left a bequest to be inherited by whoever survived longest out of Æthelbald, Ethelred and Alfred. That the first brother was established, in contrast to the 9-year-old Alfred, did not bode well for the latter. However, luckily for Alfred and a unified England, Æthelwulf's will would not be done. Æthelwulf died on 13th of January, 858, his body initially interred at Steyning in Sussex, though it was eventually relocated to Winchester by Alfred. Initially, Æthelbald indeed succeeded as King of Wessex and, ironically, and to the horror of Asser, married his father's widow Judith, still a teenager, and the prospect of a Carolingian marriage, obviously too good to pass up. Ethelbert too succeeded to his half of the kingdom, and eventually to the whole of his father's realm, given his elder brother's death just 2 years later. Wessex was thus unified again through the luck of life's lottery in 860. Not only was Æthelbald dead, but both Ethelred and Alfred were too young to succeed in Wessex. Furthermore, Ethelbert set aside his father's will, intending his brother Ethelred to succeed a united realm. So that was the life and times of Æthelwulf, controversial second king of the House of Egbert and father of Alfred the Great. As you can imagine, making these epic videos is both enjoyable but also time consuming, so your support is greatly appreciated. Sharing and liking this video helps the channel immensely. Anyway, what do you think of Æthelwulf? Was he a great Anglo-Saxon king who built on and consolidated the gains won by Egbert, who was a pious if politically naive ruler? Or was he unwittingly almost the cause of the ruin of his house, foolishly abandoning his kingdom in a time of war and crisis? Let us know in the comments, and I shall see you next time.